Hello, and welcome to the Further podcast, where we explore the far reaches of the human experience, from missions to Mars to skydiving to blowing one's mind with psychoactive substances. These conversations offer insight into how these extreme experiences showcase the human spirit and just might teach us how to live our everyday lives a bit better. I'm your host, Haley Maria Duran, and I study the effects of psychedelics and other out there experiences on people's minds and brains. As some of you may know, a lot of my research focuses on understanding how psychedelics might impact people with a history of psychotic disorders. Historically, there's been a lot of concern. Even having a family history is a contraindication for participating in pretty much all of the clinical trials. But Dr. Julie Holland is doing something quite brave and is actually starting a trial examining how people with psychotic disorders are impacted by MDMA. And she's been wanting to run this trial for 40 years, actually. So in this episode, we talk a bit about what sparked her interest in this topic, about psychotic disorders more generally, and also some of her books that she's published. So quite a wide-ranging discussion, but I had a lot of fun chatting with her. And there will be more stuff on Further about psychedelics and psychosis. I am in the process of finishing up my dissertation now, which will be 3 papers focusing on psychedelics and psychosis. Some of the projects are imaging focused, some of them are qualitative, so it's really going to be a bunch of different things, but hopefully soon there will be an episode covering that as well. So you'll just have to wait for that. All right, so I am here with Julie Holland today, and she is an author of several books, including Good Chemistry and Weekends at Bellevue. She has been involved with psychedelic science, especially MDMA, for decades, and is planning out some interesting research with MDMA and schizophrenia, actually. So today we're going to learn a bit about her experience working in a psychiatric ER, and why, maybe the contraindication with psychedelics, more specifically MDMA and psychosis, might not be a 100% thing.
Yes.
All right, great. So I guess just starting at the beginning, I suppose, you worked in a psychiatric ER, Bellevue, in New York City, which is one of the most hectic ERs in the country. And so during your time there, you encountered a lot of people with psychosis, with mania, so you're quite familiar with all that. Maybe you could just tell us a bit about your experience there.
Yeah, I'm really tempted to go even earlier because I've been fascinated by psychosis for a really long time, since I was in high school. And I can tell you why in a minute. But it's one of the reasons why I wanted to be a doctor and go to medical school. And MDMA was the other reason why I really wanted to be a doctor and go to medical school. But even when I was in medical school, I did research on auditory hallucinations that allowed me to interview 100 actively psychotic and hallucinating individuals over a few years when I was at Temple in Philadelphia. So I got very good at talking to people who were hallucinating and talking to them about their voices, or just being in the room with somebody who was actively psychotic and getting comfortable with what that felt like. And then when I went to, after med school, I did my residency at Mount Sinai in New York City. And there I actually switched my entire schedule around so that I could work for a whole year on the schizophrenia research ward at the Bronx VA hospital. And I was doing research with schizophrenia, and I was actively recruiting. I would go to the Veterans Chronic Hospital upstate in Montrose. I would sort of look around for people who looked like they had schizophrenia and talk to them and check out their chart and see if they wanted to come down to the Bronx VA to do some research. So always been very comfortable talking to people who are in altered states, very early experiences being in altered states. One of the stories I just want to tell you in the beginning, because I think it'll help us talk about everything that comes after, is that when I was about 14, 15 years old, I was very interested in psychedelics. I had read all the books. I had tried mushrooms. I had tried LSD. I really wanted to try mescaline. And in an attempt to try mescaline, I ended up experiencing PCP. And so I had like a floridly sort of psychotic evening, basically. During the course of the evening, I had a lot of psychotic symptoms. And also, I had things that are very specific to PCP. Like I had micropsia, macropsia, which is this idea that things look tiny, things look huge. I'm walking down the street. I feel like I am as tall as the telephone poles, maybe even taller. And then just a couple minutes later, I'm small or everything's small. So I had visual distortions of things being huge, tiny. I also had referential ideation. I felt like things were messages that I needed to interpret. If somebody touched their nose, I thought it was like a signal that I was supposed to know what that means. I felt like two people in front of me who were speaking were like putting on a play for my benefit, but I didn't understand the words. Jimi Hendrix was playing on the radio. I knew that he had died of a drug overdose. This meant that the radio was telling me that I was about to die of a drug overdose. Lots of things that happen when people are psychotic. I got to experience, and it got me, maybe not that day, but in the days and weeks that followed, got me really interested in like, what is psychosis? What is the definition of breaking from reality? What about if you know that you've taken a drug, and is that still psychosis? But also, and again, not right away, but eventually, I think it really created the foundation of my interest in harm reduction, which was like 15-year-old Julie on some level being kind of pissed off. Like, hey, I wanted to try mescaline. Why can't I just try mescaline? Why did I end up with PCP? This is bullshit. Like this sort of like very deep basic belief in cognitive liberty and this idea that if you want to try a drug, you should be able to do it safely, and the government shouldn't really get in your way. It's because of our nation's drug policy that a lot of our drug taking behavior is so risky. So lifelong sort of commitment to harm reduction, lifelong commitment to helping people who are experiencing psychotic symptoms, and also just like very interested in people with schizophrenia. And that's really, one of the reasons I worked at Bellevue for 9 years, and I lasted longer than most doctors last in the psych ER at Bellevue. And it's because I love people in general. Like I am a people person, I'm a psychiatrist. I'll talk to anybody, love asking questions and figuring out, what you're interested in, what your perspective is. But I particularly love people who are in a psychotic episode. And I'm a singer. I like poetry. I love, listening to people talk and the way that their speech is almost like a poem or a song, how they sort of, what I wrote about in Weekends at Bellevue is it's like following somebody in the woods, and then you get to the stream and you're just stepping on the same rocks they stepped on as they got across the stream, because that's how you get across the stream. You follow them on each rock. And so if they're talking, you're just following that conversation, and it's going to go in some weird places, but it's also going to give you clues to who they are and what they care about. Long answer.
Wow. Yeah, I definitely appreciate how that experience, that it sounds like in a lot of ways it could have gone quite poorly, and you just could have become like terrified of drugs basically, and instead it became something where you were inspired to go on and do research ultimately. So that's quite exciting. And I think another thing that is not often talked about is when people are having like psychotic symptoms after taking hallucinogens, quote unquote, who knows what that is, that sometimes it can be drugs that have quite different effects, like PCP. So,
yeah, like even, I think colloquially now when people are talking about psychedelics, and they'll include MDMA, ketamine, I include cannabis, there's a big umbrella for the term psychedelic, which is basically mind manifesting. It's showing you the way that you think or the way your mind works. So, with that big umbrella, things like cannabis and ketamine absolutely fit under the big tent of psychedelics. But I don't like to use the word hallucinogen. I know that it's sort of a medically accepted word, but I certainly would never ever say that MDMA is a hallucinogen. I think that there are some experiences where you have your heart opened, You have your mind opened. To me, you're seeing things more clearly. You're seeing things as they really are. You may have some visual illusions during that time. You may notice that the towels are breathing, or the trees are breathing, or things are moving slightly that shouldn't. But that's not really a hallucination. It is a very broad term, and it really drives me crazy, actually, when these papers, they're scientific papers, they're psychiatric journals, and they're saying, these drugs are correlated with these symptoms. But the problem is that the catch-all of the drugs is so wide-ranging, pharmacologically different, phenomenologically different in terms of how they make you feel or act, and they're lumping them all together and then saying that they cause these other symptoms. And it's like, yes, well, within that lump, PCP will reliably induce positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Ketamine at a high enough dose will reliably induce some symptoms in the syndrome of schizophrenia. It's not saying it causes schizophrenia, but there are things that happen during an experienced high-dose ketamine or high-dose PCP that have similarities with the experiences that happen in somebody who has schizophrenia. That doesn't mean that these drugs cause schizophrenia, and it doesn't even mean that these drugs will induce some sort of long-acting psychosis. But what we have all done for decades now is we have said, if you have bipolar, if you have schizophrenia, even if you have like a first-degree relative, you have a sister or father with these chronic psychotic illnesses, we're going to say that you can't be in this research project. No one is saying that you can't, on your own or with a lot of guidance and people taking care of you and support and integration. I mean, nobody's saying you can't do it. It's just that for clinical research, no one wants to take the chance of having these patients come in. So one of the things that's starting to happen now, we saw a study of people with bipolar 2 where they really responded very well to mushrooms. So I think that was reassuring. We are gearing up to do a study at UCLA and also in New York at Zucker Hillside. It's like a multi-center trial with an East Coast and West Coast division, and I lovingly refer to it as Biggie and Tupac, except that this East Coast and West Coast, these two teams have decided to cooperate, collaborate, and what I love about that is that you get more power in the data. If two different studies run 10 people each, but they don't coordinate how much they're giving, what they're measuring, then those two studies can't combine their data. But if they do collaborate and coordinate, you've got a study of 20 instead of 10 done in half the time, and it's great for everybody. So I'm really, really thrilled that the UCLA team and the Zucker Hillside team are getting together to do this MDMA schizophrenia study. I don't want to say convinced because that's wrong. I have been curious, and I've had some strong intuition that it may be that people with schizophrenia who experience MDMA may have a respite of their symptoms. They may have a quieting of their thoughts. It may just be a little bit easier to calm down and take a look at where they've been and where they're going. Just like it is for most people when they take MDMA, it's a little bit of a timeout and a breather where you can get the 3,000-foot view on one of the metaphors I use a lot when I talk about psychedelics and MDMA is like if you're playing a video game and you don't know the map of the playing field, you're not going to play the game very well. And if you can pull out and see the macro of the entire map of what you've been playing in, you may realize that you're only going around in circles in one corner and you're only using 10% of the game map, and so for somebody with schizophrenia to have a quiet couple of hours where they can really, get a bird's eye view of where they are and where they've been and where they want to go and who can help them get there, and also maybe just a couple of hours of less paranoia around who is trying to treat you and support you, and maybe less paranoia around your family or around your psychiatrist, or maybe some sort of understanding of, where your treatment has gone and where you'd like your treatment to go next. We just don't know. It hasn't been done. And my intuition is that it might be helpful. And if it's not, then I'm sorry and I was wrong, and we will at least know that, yeah, you can't do this. It's too dangerous. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. But we don't know. The studies haven't been run yet. One of the things I'm trying to do actually is raise money for these studies. If you go to drholland.com, there's a little button to donate, even $3, $5, doesn't matter. I am trying to donate. I am trying to sort of fundraise for the study just because it's so important to me. And I have been literally wanting the study to happen for this summer. It'll be 40 years which is crazy, but it's true.
40 years.
Yeah.
How did you even put that together like 40 years ago? Like, what made you think that this could even be possible?
Well, it really came out of the very, very first time that I ever took MDMA, and I was amazed at how quiet my brain was. And one of the first thoughts I had, because I'm so interested in psychosis and schizophrenia, was like, this kind of quiet would be paradise for somebody who's hallucinating.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also sort of tracks with what I have observed so far in some of my research that I've conducted, where just looking at people who are using psychedelics naturalistically out there in the wild with a history of psychosis, not focused on MDMA especially, focused more on classic psychedelics, but some people at least do report a sense that their mind is quieter. Some people actually, in a survey study that we conducted that's coming out, actually had fewer auditory hallucinations after using psychedelics. Or it was the more psychedelics that they had used, there was an association such that there was a reduction in auditory hallucinations. So certainly interesting. Maybe we just had a weird sample, but it does, from what I have observed in my research, seem to allow people a bit of stillness when they are otherwise kind of just following a bunch of random clues that lead to nowhere and developing these delusional frameworks.
When I think about the study showing that the default mode network has like less coherence as a circuit, and that other circuitry either has more coherence or there's just more crosstalk between the circuits, that to me, that kind of neuroplasticity and that kind of sort of circuit restructuring, even if it's temporary, I think that you would see some sort of change in their symptoms. And also, like, what if some of the sort of gas that's driving the hallucinations, what if it is tied into that default mode circuitry?
Mm-hmm.
If you're quieting, one of the analogies I love thinking about when it comes to like psychedelics and quieting that default mode is like, if you're in a classroom of 30 kids and there's always like 5 kids who are raising their hands and answering all the questions, and the teacher's just really kind of focusing on the smart kids, and the 25 other kids, well, I'm smart or not, whatever, they're just not talking. And so they don't get to talk. And if you pull those 5 kids out of the classroom, 2 things happen. One is all the other kids in the class may start talking, but the other is that they can communicate among themselves, that the 5 kids aren't taking up so much space, and everybody else gets a turn, and everybody else gets to see who else is in the room, what else they have to say. And that's like tripping. Your usual circuitry, your default circuitry, how am I doing, who am I, offline. Everything else gets a chance to come online and to communicate with each other. So, and like, even if it's just a few hours, I think that's very potentially beneficial. Your brain learns a new way of being. Maybe there's some other circuits that get laid down. Maybe your default now is a little bit different than it was before. But also, like, experientially, you've had a chance to see things differently, to have a different perspective, to, have your mind opened or your heart opened, or, all these other sort of metaphors that come down to like a new way of appreciating something. And sometimes that's all it takes, in psychiatry. I mean, yes, I've worked at Bellevue. I worked there for 9 years. I ran the psych ER on Saturday nights and Sunday nights. And what you don't see at Bellevue, sadly, is learning and growing and changing. You just see people coming in over and over the same, they're still drunk, they're like, they've spent all their money on crack and sex workers, and they're, suicidal at the end of their sort of cycle of spending their money. But it keeps happening over and over and over, and there's not much learning, there's not much growth, there's not much change. And the whole point of psychedelic assisted therapy, MDMA assisted therapy, is that you have a few hours where you can look at things from a different perspective and have a different experience. I wish we could do that in the psych ER. What I do have in my private practice is people I've treated for decades who do sometimes grow and change and have, really significant shifts in their behavior and their perspective. And some of my private practice patients who opt to sort of go off and have their own experiences with psychedelics or with microdosing or this sort of thing, I think that they tend to have really like accelerated growth and change more than people who are just taking a daily dose of SSRIs. And that's what the book Moody Bitches was sort of starting to get at.
Love that title.
So, the funny thing about the title of Moody Bitches is it got me a really good book advance, but it didn't sell very well because I think it was kind of, in the end, it was a little bit of an off-putting title. Like, I think the women in New York City who I was pitching the book to, who work in the publishing industry, they loved it. They got it. But I kind of feel bad about it because it has a ton of useful information that went out into the world and didn't really, like, make a splash. And I think that the title Moody Bitches, which I thought was very tongue-in-cheek. I have a great sense of humor. I don't call women moody bitches. The subtitle of the book was like the truth about the drugs you're taking and the sleep you're missing, the sex you're not having, and what's really making you feel crazy. The end
I
of
love
Moody
it.
Bitches, the premise is that women are naturally emotional and cyclical, and some women are really being medicated to look more like men and be more stable and less fluid and less cyclical and, less hormonal. And some of the women who are taking antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, they just have a natural cyclicity in their mood. And like, you don't necessarily have to medicate that cyclicity away. But the last chapter in Moody Bitches talks about why we're feeling so crazy. And I really, in that chapter, focused in on disconnection. We're disconnected from our bodies, we're disconnected from our environment and nature, and all these ways that we're disconnected that are making us feel terrible. And then the book after Moody Bitches, which is Good Chemistry, is all about connection. Yes, we're disconnected. Yes, we have a loneliness epidemic. We have a suicide epidemic. We have deaths of despair. We're a mess. And by the way, this book was right before COVID. Everything has only gotten so much worse since COVID. But the book was about how do we connect? If disconnection is making us feel crazy and it's making us sick, then how do we connect? And what are the benefits of connecting in our bodies and our minds? And that's really, again, where cannabis and MDMA and other psychedelics come in, is that they can help us connect to ourselves. They can help us feel connected to the universe, to the earth. Or if we're with a group of people, perhaps taking these altering substances, we may feel really connected to that group. I'm also really interested in family psychedelic therapy, which people aren't talking about yet, but they will, or family MDMA assisted therapy. Like, there's a lot of shit that gets built up, between families and also intergenerationally. Some of my patients who will go away somewhere to a retreat, they want to have an ayahuasca retreat or a psilocybin experience, and they come back and they're like, I couldn't even get to my shit. I was so working through my grandparents' trauma and my parents' trauma, and like, I have to go back to focus on my trauma. This intergenerational stuff, it matters more than we think. And I think that doing some work within the family, I mean, it sounds like hell on some level, tripping with your parents, like, no. But I do think that there's something there for some people, that some of the interpersonal work and intrapersonal work can be accelerated with group experiences or with family therapy experiences. A little off topic from psychosis, but maybe it's just
No,
so crazy.
I mean, a lot of people who have a history of psychosis, if you go back and look at their family history, they've been through a lot of trauma a lot of times. So that's often a huge contributing factor. So it does connect, I think. And I think that ultimately, if psychedelic assisted therapy was ever to be implemented in a way that was actually economically viable, unless you were just working with shorter acting psychedelics, having some sort of group therapy session might actually work better. I don't know. It's messy, or at least group integration or something. So it does make sense.
Well, what's good about group, we all know, there's a couple things good about group. One is it's very efficient, like money-wise. If to have each person treated individually versus running like eight or 10 or 20 people through at a time, you're treating more people. But also, we are all really living these sort of atomized lives where we're very disconnected and very separated. And so when you run a group together, you're creating this like social cocoon where everybody can have friends after and have like built-in peer support after, which is great and free and like a win-win. I think everybody potentially gets better when they're run through a group and they have group support. It's a little tricky. I'm not necessarily saying that you want to run a group of people who are acutely psychotic, but if you could have people with a similar diagnosis who are going through a lot of the same stressors in the same group, that's great. I mean, we know what that does in terms of like 12-step groups or, Overeaters Anonymous or, sex addicts or anything. Like, you get a group of people who, there's a shorthand and you understand me and you get me and I don't have to explain everything because you've had this too. It helps. It helps people work through their issues, especially if other people have found things that work. So I think that group therapy is inevitable. And family therapy is not inevitable at all, but I wish it were, because I think there are definitely some people with psychiatric complaints where things worked out within the family would help everyone, not just the, identified patient.
That makes sense. Still, I think it's a ways off, but it could happen eventually, and it could certainly be happening now in retreat center settings. I guess maybe like what other than psychedelics do you think people could do to become more connected? Because it's such a big issue right now.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, Good Chemistry came out before COVID. And the whole thing in that book is like, put down your phone, get rid of your laptop, go outside, go be with your friends, like cuddle, get naked, eye contact, play sports together, just like all these things that all of a sudden with COVID, nobody could follow any of the instructions, for how to connect. And the truth is, during COVID, everybody got more attached to their phone, more attached to their laptops and, just like watching stuff. Everybody was kind of zoning out. Nobody bugged the kids anymore about like, get off your computer, go outside and play. Like, that just stopped, and 4 years later, we didn't really go back to the way things were before COVID. So I do feel like we're more isolated than we were before I wrote the book. And it's hard to find third spaces. I'm on the board of Psychedelic Assembly, which is a third space, meeting space for psychonauts in Manhattan. It's at 222 East 46th Street. It's called the Blue Building. And they have like Find the Others meetings and all sorts of networking. And, we need to have more places like this with these kind of third spaces. It's not work. It's not school. It's just a place where people go to hang out that isn't a bar. And like in the old days, you had bowling leagues and tennis night and poker night. People got together with their friends once a week. My dad used to play tennis every Tuesday night. His friend Eddie Marmer would come over to pick him up and they would go play tennis. And like there were other people there that were friends of his. And, people would go out and do things with their friends back in the day. There's less of that, there are fewer bowling leagues and potlucks and get-togethers and church socials and all that stuff. There's just fewer opportunities for people to get together. So you have to sort of find the third spaces, make the third spaces. I mean, I know most of the cities I've been in, there's something, there's some coffee shop or bookshop or something that also doubles as a place where they get together for lectures and talks, and what's nice is that there are definitely places where people get together to talk about psychedelic ideas or have psychedelic conferences. And they stopped for a while in COVID, but they certainly have started up again.
Yeah, I think that in some sense, the community element of psychedelics, just having integration groups, in some ways that can be more helpful for people than the actual experience itself. Like here in Birmingham, we have an integration group that meets weekly, and people are just very supportive to each other there. Some people go to it who aren't even using psychedelics, but it's just a very open space. And I think that openness is probably what makes it so helpful. Not the fact that sometimes some of the people there trip and talk about their experiences.
Yeah, well, it's also the openness to growth, to looking at your own shadow stuff. I was going to swear and say looking at your own shit, but you don't have to. You're doing shadow work. You're exploring yourself. The other thing I talk about in Good Chemistry is just if you don't feel like connecting with other people, you could still connect with yourself through all sorts of meditation, yoga, chanting, sensory deprivation tanks, whatever is your thing, but you're committing to connect with yourself and not just be distracted doom scrolling. And then there's also just, connecting with the earth, with the planet, like taking your shoes off and be like connecting with dirt between your toes or dirt in your fingers, doing gardening without your gloves to just really feel like you're connected with the earth and that you are nature, It's not that you go out in nature. You are also nature. Like, you're an animal. So, yeah. It's tricky. And I think people feel really isolated. And I think that the phones give you this sort of artificial sense that you're connected, but it is not exactly, it's not 100% connection. It's something sort of saccharine and artificial and synthetic that you think if you can make up for it in volume. I say this every time I get interviewed, but I love this quote, and I think it was Gabor Mate, but I'm really not sure who first said this quote, but it's popular in addiction medicine, and it is this: you can never get enough of something that almost works. And the phone makes us almost feel connected in so many ways. And so we just keep going and hoping that the almost reaches critical mass, that like you make up for quality with quantity. But it doesn't work. It is like scratching around an itch. It doesn't really get to what you're needing, which is like real, skin to skin, eye to eye contact.
Yeah, it makes sense that you would focus so much on connection with just the sort of experiences that psychedelics can inspire in people, where they feel so connected to everything. And I think that for people with psychotic disorders or other serious mental illnesses, they're just oftentimes they feel so disconnected from society, in part because of all the stigma surrounding these conditions. I mean,
yeah,
with psychedelics and psychosis, thinking that like the worst outcome of doing psychedelics would be becoming psychotic is kind of almost reinforcing that stigma, because there are worse outcomes. You could commit suicide. So, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I learned when I was researching good chemistry, and also Moody Bitches, actually, I mean, it started with Moody Bitches, that I have a whole chapter called Inflammation, the Key to Everything, where I talk about how being in fight or flight puts you in a pro-inflammatory state. And the thing that's best for your brain and body is to be in an anti-inflammatory state. And that's where you have good social skills. When you're in fight or flight, you're naturally kind of paranoid. And the problem is, though, is that when you have a chronic psychotic illness, you get isolated, you get ostracized and stigmatized. And that puts you in a fight or flight state, which makes the paranoia worse. So it is a vicious cycle. That you're isolated, you're ostracized, you get more paranoid because of the ostracism, and then you are, you're never going to get sort of like a group of friends that can help you act normal. And the other thing we do in America, and they don't do this in every other culture, because when I traveled around the world, I really noticed this, is that here, if you're a person with psychosis, you end up getting housed, sort of warehoused with other people with psychosis. You end up in these adult homes or state hospitals or like chronic VA hospitals with all these other people who also are psychotic. And what other communities do is they will sort of sprinkle the unhealthy person or the atypical person amongst the more neurotypical people, so that they get sort of absorbed, and also that they've got people around them who are keeping an eye on them or who can model healthy behavior. The story I wrote, I think I wrote about this in Weekends at Bellevue, that I was in Vietnam and I saw that, we're in this little village, and there was this one like very significantly developmentally delayed person in the village, but his job was to hit the noon bell every day so that people knew what time it was. And he showed up and hit that bell every day at noon, and, people in the village helped him hit it, but he had a job and he was a part of the community, and it kept him, organized about what day it was and what time. I mean, it did things for him, it did things for the community, and it was just like a real, lesson to me that like, in the right circumstances, you can disseminate the people who are sort of other, who think a different way or act a different way. Instead of putting them all together in one hospital, you could sort of sprinkle them in the community where the community can stand it, because it's like a 25-to-1 or 95-to-1 ratio, and so people can model healthy behavior, and the person who's atypical can, try to sort of stick with the crowd and try to do what they do a little bit and fit in, because then it's self-reinforcing. They act a little less crazy, they get a few more friends, it makes them feel more comfortable and more connected and less in fight or flight, then they're less paranoid, and so that's a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of lower income countries, they actually have better outcomes for people having a psychotic episode, in part because, like with that man you mentioned, like they're still integrated into the community. So I think that's really important, to keep having people integrated. And it also reminds me a bit of a study that was done in the 1950s where they actually did group therapy with people with schizophrenia, with normal people on LSD. And, they found that some of the schizophrenia patients became more sort of involved and interactive with others. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, the other thing is that like you were getting at this before, that a lot of people with chronic psychotic illness have horrendous histories of childhood trauma. And so they, just like everyone else, deserve to be able to process their childhood trauma with MDMA or with psychedelics because it could help. If they've got layers and layers of stuff going on and it's not all trauma, but some of it is trauma, like let's at least help the parts that we can help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In your book, Good Chemistry, you also talk quite a bit about how oxytocin might be playing a role in the effects of psychedelics and MDMA. And it sounds like that could be both a good thing and a bad thing. Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say a lot of this is more conjecture than proven, but some of it is proven. I mean, we know that as much as adrenaline and cortisol fuel the sympathetic state, the fight or flight state, we know that oxytocin is really the sort of gas of the engine of the parasympathetic state, the rest, digest, and repair. And oxytocin is very involved in neuroplasticity, in wound repair. And the one that we know about, and everyone sort of accepts, and I would say does have more sort of settled science behind it, is the trusting and the bonding that oxytocin seems to cement. So like a newborn infant suckling mother, that's a high oxytocin state for the baby and the mother. And there's a pretty intense bonding going on there. And even like when a woman's pregnant, increased oxytocin rates are enabling like intense remodeling of the brain, which is all about neuroplasticity. And so, and MDMA engenders a high oxytocin state. What I couldn't find or prove completely was that the other classical psychedelics increase oxytocin, but we do know that the 5-HT2A receptor, the sort of psychedelic receptor, that does make a dimer. It dimerizes with the oxytocin receptor. So we know that there's crosstalk between the serotonin system and the oxytocin system. And my sort of theory is that when you're peaking on acid or mushrooms and you get to this place in your trip where you feel very connected and plugged in, not as a baby nursing a mother, but like as a being sort of sucking on the teat of the universe. Like there's a time when you're tripping, if you're lucky, and you have a really intense mystical experience where there's a void and then there's the light and you feel sort of connected with everything and you feel like everything is connected and you're kind, you feel sort of plugged in to the universe or to the Alex and Allison Gray talk about like the universal lattice work of energy that connects everything. And like there's a time when you're tripping where you're like, yes, there is a a universal lattice work of energy that connects us. I believe it. Maybe I can't see it, but like yes, it exists and I'm in it. And so that to me, I have to assume is a really high oxytocin state because you are like bonding and trusting with the universe. I'm assuming that it is the crosstalk between the 5-HT2A receptor and the oxytocin receptor, which might give that sort of sensation of connection. But I love to look at things pharmacologically and to sort of find the biological basis of things. And I am wed to a man that I've known for 30 years now, who is not at all pharmacological, biological, and is always sort of getting me to try to look at the other side of things. But old habits die hard. All my training, my undergrad education also was like the biological basis of behavior. So I am a bit of a materialist, and I like to look for the pharmacology, what is the brain doing? What is the chemistry of the brain doing? I mean, that stuff really interests me. I'm a sucker for the, beautiful color images from PET scans, just like everyone else is. But obviously there's so much more. I was just an external reviewer for somebody's PhD dissertation, which is not something that I do regularly at all. But this was something that I was very, very interested in. And it was, I don't want to misspeak, but it was like this self-concept clarity and
Mm.
self-concept congruence, sort of like who am I and do I know who I am? And one of the interesting things that she showed, this woman Amber Amendola, was basically showed that like somewhere between 2 and 20 uses of psychedelics, sometimes people have less self-congruence, that they're not sure who they are. But once they get above like 20, it increases. So there is this time, I think, when you're maybe finding yourself, and you're not sure who you are, and things change, and a trip can change you tremendously. But if you keep tripping, you may end up finding really having, a solid sense of who you are and what matters to you. And I'm not obviously suggesting that you trip 20 times in a row because, like a good hoagie, I did spend 9 years in Philadelphia. You chew and then you take a big bite and then you chew and then you digest and then you poop. And like that's all integration. You get a couple of very big bites when you trip and then you got to go home and chew and swallow and digest and metabolize and figure out what you figured out.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully put it to good use. I think that, over a lifetime of having these kind of experiences and integrating them and waiting before you have another experience that you can integrate, you can get to a place where you have a stronger sense of who you are and what's important to you. And so maybe people with chronic psychotic illnesses can also benefit from that. Yes, you're going to need a lot more support. You're going to need a psychiatrist who is brave, who can be with you. And, it's important to know that there are some medicines for bipolar disorder which really do not agree with psychedelics. Like lithium in particular does not
Mm-hmm.
go well with mushrooms or with acid, and that's something, to keep in mind. But there are some other mood stabilizers that actually don't really get in the way as much when you're talking about mushrooms or acid or ayahuasca. One of the things I do in my private practice is if I have somebody who really does want to do these things, I can switch their medicines around a little bit to put them on a medicine that I think will be less interfering. There's a mood stabilizer that I use a lot called Lamictal, lamotrigine, and it interferes a little bit at higher doses with ketamine, but it doesn't really interfere with a lot of other psychedelics. And ibogaine is less clear, but pretty clear with MDMA and psilocybin mushrooms and LSD that that is one mood stabilizer that you don't necessarily have to stop. And with the schizophrenia study, we're trying to find people on meds where they don't have to stop their meds to have MDMA. And this is we could do a whole podcast on this because it's totally complicated. I'm not the last word on this, but this issue of people getting off their psych meds because they want to have a psychedelic experience. And what they don't realize is that it's really complicated getting off of psych meds. And sometimes your symptoms get a lot worse when you're coming off the meds. And it doesn't mean that you can't, but it's a slow process. You've got to do it with other people. You can't do it alone. And sometimes it's not worth it, to come off your meds for something. And so that's what's really great about ketamine. You don't have to come off your meds for ketamine. You don't have to come off your meds to microdose. And you can get a certain amount of trauma processing done with microdosing also. So, I don't want it to be that somebody who has got a history of psychosis means they can never do anything. And, sorry, none of these meds are for you. Like, that's not fair. But of course, there are like a protected class of people, and they are like a vulnerable patient population. So you really have to have a lot of caveats and safety in place before you even start to talk about how could we possibly do this and how would this work. But, never say never. I think that there are some psychiatrists who are going to feel more comfortable doing this than others. And I hope people can find brave clinicians to help them if they feel comfortable and they want to do this kind of exploration.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that lithium is really problematic with psychedelics because it seems to kind of tremendously increase the risk that somebody could have like a seizure.
Yeah.
Or just, end up in the ER. It is not a good
or
time.
just like a very, very way too powerful trip.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, this whole issue of interactions between prescription psychiatric medicine and psychedelics should be a specialty. It's complicated. It comes up a lot. There are a lot of people on meds, especially in America. So there's like 25, 30, 40% of adults are taking antidepressants or sleeping pills or anti-anxiety meds. And a lot of those people are curious about ketamine or mushrooms or LSD or ayahuasca or ibogaine, and each one of those questions is like an hour-long discussion. And some of it is conflicting also, like bupropion, also known as Wellbutrin, with MDMA. Two different effects, one up arrow and one down arrow. So, what do you believe? It's hard to predict. And, one of the things that I am doing, but not officially, and I wish somebody would officially do this, is just collect the data. There are plenty of people out there who are like, I'm on this med, I couldn't feel mushrooms. I'm on these meds, mushrooms hit me too hard. I know Kit Bonson of FDA was collecting this information a long time ago, and she did publish some things. Catherine Bonson, B-O-N. But there needs to be more. There are a few people out there. I know Spirit Pharmacists. There's a few other people who are sort of specializing and advising people. It's almost like a medical clearance. If somebody, like, when we were on an inpatient psychiatric ward and somebody was going to have electroshock therapy, we had to do a bunch of things before their treatment to make sure that they were medically stable for the treatment. And it's kind of like this with psychedelic therapies, that somebody has to do a little bit of a clearance for the patient ahead of time, like, are you on any medicines that are going to be problematic? Like, are you on antidepressants or ADD meds and you want to have ayahuasca? You got a problem. You can't be on those meds and then safely take ayahuasca. So what are you going to do about it? Are you going to slowly come off your meds, or are you just going to decide that it's better for you to just have a ketamine or microdosing sessions because you can't? But, like, do you know that that's a situation? Have we really educated people enough about these drug interactions? Because they're a big deal and they're complicated. And like I said, every drug that you're interested in trying comes with a list of medicines you should not be on if you want to experience that drug.
Yeah, and I think there's quite a few people who they kind of take matters into their own hands, and they will either, go off their meds for like a day and maybe be fine, or they will take a very large dose. Sometimes they're fine, sometimes they're not. So it definitely, I agree, is its own topic and something that's really pertinent as more people start using these substances.
There's definitely misinformation out there. There's no question. And, I think one of the biggest things that's sort of misinformed, because in other branches of medicine, if you want to come off of a medicine because of an interaction, you just stop the medicine for 5 half-lives and then you're off of it and you go do this other thing. But with psych meds, it's not as simple as just 5 half-lives and you're done at all. Like, and I never recommend abrupt discontinuation of any psychiatric meds. I mean, I've been a practicing psychiatrist since, I don't know, early 90s. I always start slow and go up slowly on meds and then go down slowly on meds when you're tapering them off. You should never abruptly stop anything. And the longer you've been on something, the more gradual the taper. It's a way to make it more comfortable if you go more slowly. And I think you have a higher likelihood of success if you go more slowly. But sometimes, it doesn't work out. Like, I have a patient who's like saying, oh, well, I just, I was going to do this thing next month, but now he's got an opening next week. And, I'm like, no, it's not next week, not recommended. And it's hard to find, because this is all illegal. It's really hard to find good medical assistance. A lot of people are afraid to talk to their psychiatrist about it, or whoever's prescribing. And some people don't, lots of people don't have psychiatrists. A lot of psych medicine in this country is prescribed by, GPs, PCPs, people who aren't psychiatrists. And people are so hesitant to tell their doctors the truth about everything, about what they're eating, what they're drinking, and from a harm reduction perspective, it's a disaster. The one thing you shouldn't be afraid is to tell your clinician the truth. But because of our drug policy and because of the stigma, people aren't comfortable talking to their doctors. Well, I kind of want to do an ayahuasca circle, but I think maybe one of these medicines. What do you think? And, it's like either the doctor doesn't know, or they don't have any sort of medical legal leg to stand on. And, we've been brought up to be, very defensive and to practice defensive medicine, which is like, what would the lawyer say?
Man. Yeah, that sounds quite tricky.
Yeah, it is, and it's too bad because the one of the first casualty in any war is the truth, and the first casualty of the drug war is accurate information about the drugs people are taking. And then the whole second casualty is that our drug supply is actually poisoned here where I live in America, and so you think you're buying a Xanax or you think you're buying MDMA and you're getting fentanyl. So, the street supply of drugs is completely poisoned now with fentanyl, and it has sort of, it's not like all over the psychedelic scene, but it has occasionally. Fentanyl has been found in tablets that at least one person thought was going to be MDMA, and they died from a single tablet. So, it used to be that we were really freaked out about people having water intoxication, taking a tablet of MDMA and then, or ecstasy or Molly or whatever you want to call it. If it happens to be MDMA, congratulations. Obviously, whatever you're buying could be anything. Testing your drug is important. Not overhydrating is important. Not overheating is important. But it used to be that, mostly we were just talking about don't overheat, don't get too hot, don't drink too much water, make sure that you, replace fluids that you're losing through sweat, drink electrolytes, don't drink a gallon of water because you can retain water and end up with a really medically dangerous situation where you've got low sodium and you're having seizures and you can die. So don't drink too much, but you have to drink some. Don't overheat. But now the message is the drug supply is poisoned and you're absolutely taking your life in your hand anytime you buy a drug. And that sucks. I feel really lucky that I was born in 65 and grew up in the 70s. Like, I had a terrible thing happen to me in that I thought I was going to have mescaline and I had PCP, but it didn't kill me. And like that was like the worst outcome was to buy something that you think is something and it's something else. Or I mean, the lousy outcome that happened more often was that you bought something you thought would be something and it was nothing and it didn't work and it didn't get you high and you learned not to trust that person in the park, whatever. But now, like those little silly lessons where some kid buys oregano and watch Square Park and it's not pot, but like now those lessons are fatal, which is just crazy to me. And it sucks. I mean, I'm really glad I grew up when I grew up, and I feel bad for people growing up in an environment now where sex can kill you, drugs can kill you, because when I was growing up, the risks were not quite so dire. There were risks, they weren't life and death.
Yeah, it definitely is something that people should be aware of. I mean, there are steps to mitigate it, though. People can use fentanyl test strips. You can do drug checking. Like, there are, it's not a guaranteed thing that
Right.
you're going to
It's
be
just
poisoned.
trying to reduce the harm.
For
But
sure.
the stakes are higher for sure now than they used to be. I mean, HIV really bumped the stakes up for drug use and for sex, and that was in the 80s. And then fentanyl is sort of the next huge bump in risk.
Yeah. Maybe that's why people are so disconnected. They're just afraid of all the risk of everything.
Yeah. Well, I do blame the phones and social media to some degree, but it's a lot of things. And this is also is another conversation, but it's like capitalism too is not doing us any favors because it's all kind of like, I got mine, you get yours, and it's social or communal. It's very kind of rugged individualistic ethos. And it's not, we're social primates and we're classified as obligatorily gregarious, which means that we have to be social in order to survive. So we are really going against our nature as social primates when we are so isolated and disconnected. And it's one of the reasons why we are sort of in fight or flight instead of in parasympathetic, is that the social isolation is a stressor that puts us in fight or flight. And so then all the things that keep your body healthy don't happen. Fight or flight is a pro-inflammatory state. There's no resting, digesting, repairing of your body, and there's no anti-inflammatory activity. And so all that isolation, it's not just bad for your mood or, dare I say, bad for your soul. It's really bad for your body. So that's what good chemistry is all about. It's about finding ways to get out of fight or flight and get over into the parasympathetic side of things. where the oxytocin is and where you can sleep and where you aren't so fat and your blood sugar is more stable and your inflammation is down and your social skills improve and you can have sex more readily. It's just, it's kind of where you want to be, is the parasympathetic side of the equation. I have to go.
Yes, yes.
Give it the clock.
Well, thank you so much. And maybe when you complete the schizophrenia and MDMA study, we'll have you back on to discuss those results.
I would really love that to happen. I hope that it does. It's gonna be a long haul. Getting the MDMA, we thought we were gonna get MDMA from MAPS and then from Lycos, and now it turns out it probably has to come from a company called Pharmala. These studies need money. If anybody is interested in this, any tiny donation will be appreciated at drholland.com.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Haley. Let's stay in touch, okay?
Cool. Bye.